Moving on to the next one, Barry, talk us through the State of a Nation address in South Africa for 2020.
Yes, so last week we had the State of the Nation where President Ramaphosa kind of had his chance to speak to the nation and speak to Parliament. And always with these annual speeches, it's always a big hoo-ha. There's lots of famous people there and there's lots of grand ceremony and whatnot. We had Siya Kolisi in the audience. We had all sorts of interesting people there. And I think it's one of those times where South Africans sit down and kind of think about what is the future of the country and what does that look like going forward. So I tuned in at, I think it was 4 p.m. I was ready for it. And believe it or not, Chad, the actual speech didn't start for 97 minutes.
What?
97 minutes of disruption before Cyril actually got a chance to speak. And
Wow.
I'm sure for all South Africans, you'll know exactly what happened because it's been all over our media. But a political party called the EFF, or the Economic Freedom Fighters, disrupted proceedings in Parliament for 97 minutes.
Wow.
And it was very, very difficult to watch. As a South African, I was a little bit embarrassed to be South African. I was thinking if I was an international investor and I was tuning in to the State of the Nation to understand what's going on in this country, and then for 97 minutes there is a complete zoo in the Parliament building, I'd be quite worried about it.
Yeah.
And so while I agree with what the EFF were protesting and while I agree with their points, the way they were bringing it up and the way they were disrespecting the Speaker of the House and the cheap whip and all these kinds of things and disrupting this very important international media event was really tough. And so I'm all for accountability and I'm all for the EFF having their say. I think they're a very important piece of South African politics. But if they don't respect the kind of the leaders in that forum and they're not able to realize that this is actually doing more harm than good for the cause. They think that they are speaking up and being kind of the accountability partners of the country, but what they're actually doing is making it a very sour taste for internationals who are looking at that. And even for South Africans, for someone like me looking at that, it made me feel pretty terrible. And so, yeah, that was kind of how it started. And so the two things the EFF were disrupting about were quite key. The first one is that former President F.W. de Klerk was in attendance here, right? And so apparently what happens is that for all of these events, all the former presidents of South Africa who are still alive are invited. And so F.W. de Klerk came and sat inside the chamber. And for those who don't know, F.W. de Klerk has a very difficult relationship with South Africa because he was the president at the end of the apartheid era, and he is the one who worked with Nelson Mandela to bring the new South Africa into place. But for a lot of the country, he's still seen as that white Afrikaans leader who presided over apartheid, and he really did. And so that was controversial enough. But what made it even worse was that a week before the SONA, he was interviewed on a local TV show, and one of the questions put to him was, do you think that apartheid was a crime against humanity? And it's pretty clear that it was. The UN have already said it's a crime against humanity. It's kind of it's clear to everybody. Yeah. And he denied it. He said it wasn't a crime against humanity on live TV.
Wow.
And so whatever his reasons for that were, it was incredibly controversial and obviously stirred up a lot of hatred and a lot of terrible, terrible things. So the moment he was sitting there in Parliament, the EFF were going crazy because they could not believe that this self-professed person who neglected the apartheid was able to sit in those hallowed worlds, right? And so that was the first thing they protested, and I completely agreed with them. I think he should never have been there. I don't know why he thought he could go and sit in that parliament, especially after what he has said the week before. Anyway, that's the first thing.
Yeah.
Once they had spent 35 minutes pointlessly discussing that, the next thing they disrupted was regarding Pravin Gordhan. And basically, Pravin Gordhan is now the Minister of the State-Owned Enterprises, so Eskom and Transnet and all these kind of things that we've chatted about on this program before. And they were kind of protesting his involvement because of the load shedding we're currently going through. So what they were saying was basically what they wanted was the president to stop everything, adjourn the meeting, go outside, fire Pravin, and then come back in and resume the speech. That's literally what they asked.
Wow.
And so it was completely ridiculous. So whether you think he's doing a good job or not, that wasn't the time to bring up this sort of thing. To try and get a minister fired in the middle of the State of the Nation address was just silly. And they wasted another 35 minutes doing that. So eventually, 97 minutes in, they eventually all walked out. So the EFF all walked out, all 60 of them, and they went and danced and sang and kind of talked to the media outside. And once they had left, then they could finally get back to the actual speech that we were all there for. Um, so by the time it got to the speech, which was 97 minutes in, it was quite anticlimactic because you've been watching the soap opera for an hour and a half, and then it got to the real meat of the deal, right? The actual speech itself, which is a bit crazy.
Yeah, it's always a funny one when it comes to South African public kind of addresses. We've seen the EFF being actually taken out of the House before. Did that happen in this time? And also, I mean, if I kind of think of Jacob Zuma as well. I know a lot of my friends even had a drinking game on every time he said a certain word. It's definitely not the way you'd like these kinds of addresses to be perceived. But yeah, certainly this is what has been established out of recent times.
Yeah, I think the EFF, they actually said before the speech that their intention was to disrupt it completely. So everyone knew what was going to happen. They had already made the intentions clear. But unfortunately, the way the South African Parliament runs, there isn't much that the chief whip can do to kind of stop what they're doing. So they're technically allowed to raise points of order as much as they want. And they can keep doing it because they've been elected into Parliament. They have a right to be there. They have a right to speak. And so they actually need to rethink about the rules and rethink about the fact that even in this kind of mass disruption where you can see that it's not genuine, the common sense needs to come into play, and we need to be able to say, cool, this is not relevant for this discussion, we need to table this, and if you're not going to table it, then I'm going to have to ask you to leave. And so a lot of the criticism the ANC has come under in the wake of this is that there was no teeth. There was no one saying, cool, that's enough, get out or shut up. And what that did was it allowed the EFF to keep pushing and keep prodding and keep raising points of order. And it came from like 20 of their members. They were just recycling all the various people, recycling the 2 points of the F.W. Clark and the Pravin Gordhan. And so that's something that needs to change if we're going to look forward. I think it's going to happen every single event if they keep doing this, because it's a strategy that works for them. It gets them a lot of media coverage. It kind of shows them as the horse that's fighting for rights. And so if we're going to have a stable kind of parliament going forward, we might have to think about changing those rules.
Yeah, I think the examples that I'm thinking about, obviously not kind of process-wise, but I think this was when there was actual violence in the parliament, and they then obviously had to get taken out. So yeah, fair point. Maybe a wider discussion in terms of process and in parliamentary process needs to be had. But in terms of the contents, once it actually got started, talk us through it.
Yeah, so I thought I'd run through some of the major points that Cyril brought up to kind of get a sense of where South Africa is going. The first one was a promise of a coherent plan for Eskom, right? So Eskom is kind of the elephant in the room here in South Africa, and so his major point was that he's going to ensure there's a coherent plan that's going to move dependence away from the national grid and into the hands of more independent power producers. So this is amazing. It all sounds great. We can only hope that the promise actually leads to the expectation.
Yeah, that's quite a big promise and quite a change in narrative in recent times. I mean, we've obviously seen a couple of weeks back they've allowed independent businesses to start producing for themselves. But when we talk about independent power producers, it almost looks like we're kind of establishing a more privatization type scenario for SA's electricity grid, much needed.
Definitely. It's a complete 180 on kind of the narrative of the last kind of 10 years. And so while there was very little detail as to how this is going to be executed, it is a step in the right direction. And hopefully it's going to start moving towards a world where we have people competing for our business, which will hopefully provide reliable and cheap electricity. Something has to change, right? Because at the moment we're looking at load shedding for the next 18 months, and that's going to have huge implications for the South African economy. So I think it's a forced 180, but a good one in the long-term future of the country.
Definitely. What else was on the bill?
All right, so much more. So the next one was talking about transparency and accountability for public service officials, right? So he announced that there's now going to be performance agreements and contracts for ministers. So basically KPIs for ministers.
Great.
I am blown away that this hasn't been in the past. I don't know how you can be a minister of such an important thing and not have performance clauses in your contract. That blows my mind. So I'm happy and shocked to hear that these weren't in place before and they're now going to be in place going forward. So obviously it's difficult to measure metrics when you're thinking about public service. It's difficult to understand what are you going to measure because a lot of it is out of your control. But having some sort of metrics, some sort of KPIs, I think is very important to ensure that we have the right people in the right jobs.
Yeah, even if those KPIs are kind of negative base, so long as this doesn't happen, that is already a lot more than what we've had in the past. But like you said, obviously, positive base tests even better. I'm sure they can come up with some things. And yeah, like you said previously, I think it's just been waiting until there is eventually a cabinet reshuffle, which obviously various presidents have done at various frequencies in the past. But yeah, this sounds like sort of human resources 101, if you'd like.
Yeah, and very important, I think, as we start to fight through the corruption we've seen and try to put in place a more sustainable model for how we're going to remunerate people, how we're going to promote people, how we're going to hold these people accountable, it's crucially important. So A+ for me from there. The next one was something that I was surprised by, is a 6.1 billion rand investment in rail, so i.e. trains, and specifically freight trains. So two particular lines, the Central Line in the Western Cape of South Africa and the Mabopane Line in Pretoria. Both are going to get substantial upgrades, both to the actual railway tracks and to the stations. And kind of the reasoning for this was to try and improve freight and improve logistics around the country. So in our country, we have a lot of things coming in from the ports, like down in the sea areas, coming in from overseas. And can we get those faster into the major cities, especially Johannesburg and Pretoria? So I think it's quite an interesting thing. I haven't thought about railways in a long time, so I know nothing about it. But a 6.1 billion rand investment in this kind of economic climate is quite a big statement. And hopefully there's some actual backing behind that decision.
Yeah, it's interesting, especially if these lines are already in place. I mean, is that 6.1 billion going to give us anything new? I certainly would find a lot of interest in that line being also tailored towards passengers. Public transport in South Africa is non-existent. It is essentially privatized. And yeah, really just an interesting one, especially when those are existing lines as well. Let's see if we sort of see any major benefits from that.
Without a doubt. The next one is something that's come up in every SONA for the last 10 years and still nothing happens, and it's that cutting business red tape, right? So we've known for a long time to start a business and to run a business in South Africa is very regulatory difficult. There are lots of hoops you have to jump through, lots of red tape, and that kind of disincentivizes a lot of entrepreneurs because it's a rather difficult business environment to start something in. And so again, he spoke about the fact they want to make it easier for entrepreneurs, they want to make it more attractive for people to start their own businesses. Again, very little detail, a lot of promises, so we'll have to wait and see what that looks like. But this is one that kind of rings hollow with a lot of people because we've heard it before and nothing has changed. So hopefully this is the start of that change.
Yeah, definitely. I've definitely heard of this a couple of times. I mean, in terms of the sort of ideas I've heard commentary on is to have a one-stop shop. So instead of going to company's house to set that up, going to SARS to set up your tax stuff, having kind of a one-stop shop for small to medium-sized enterprises. And yeah, it kind of, like you said, has been ringing hollow, especially because we know how much emphasis the government are placing on state-owned enterprises. And really for job creation and for sort of economic development, the small to medium-sized space is one that has been underserved for a long time. So hopefully there'll be some movement this year.
Definitely. We'll have to wait and see there. The next one is a tourism-based one. There was a lot of chat about major tourist attractions, specifically things like Cape Town, the Drakensberg, the Kruger National Park, trying to have more security in those major tourist attractions to try and ensure that people aren't put off by the kind of the crime statistics of the country. So it's a little bit of a strange one. I understand why they're doing it, because we need that tourism money and we need to be able to take care of foreigners who come to this land. But also, it's a little bit insensitive sometimes to the people who are living in those areas about how they're now going to put security to protect foreigners coming in for their super expensive Camps Bay vacation, rather than the actual people living in, say, Khayelitsha, or the people living in the city, right? So it's a bit of a strange one. I understand why it's in place, and maybe that tourism money is super important for the rest of the economy, and I think it is. But it kind of comes out as a little bit insensitive towards the rest of the country who are dealing with the crime problems that we are.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree that this is not sufficient at all. That's my take on it, at least. I think a complete overhaul of the policing system, there's obviously a lot of inequality in South Africa, and so a lot of crime stems from that. So there's much bigger problems here, and obviously something like this is really just putting a little band-aid on, like you say, just for foreign investment, just for a little bit foreign expenditure. I've certainly seen that perception on the side of the pond, especially when my wedding is taking place in Pretoria this year, to try and convince some people from this side of the world, or at least even from Canada and those kinds of places, Canada, New Zealand. I've got friends from all over now, and to try and get them to come through to South Africa, where they've only seen the bad things on the front pages. And fair enough. I mean, you and I would both have fairly close interactions with people who have had really, really terrible things happen to them. So I completely see the concern, but I don't think this one is sufficient. A lot more work is needed here.
Yeah, without a doubt. The next one is a huge boost on infrastructure. So I don't know where they're going to get the money from, but they're claiming that they're going to be spending 700 billion rand on various infrastructure development projects. Some of the kind of the categories under that is student accommodation, social housing, water production, rail freight lines, embedded electricity generation, municipal bulk infrastructure, and broadband rollouts. And so lots of very important infrastructure for cities around South Africa. I think it's much needed in our economy, but it's hard to justify sometimes because we haven't seen the economic growth necessary to fund this. So South Africa is in a very difficult position when it comes to the debt crisis. That we are at very, very dangerous levels. And Cyril mentioned that we have a very difficult budget speech that's going to come up very soon because our GDP growth obviously is not growing that much, if at all, and debt's reaching quite dangerous levels. So it's always a chicken and egg here. You need the infrastructure growth to be able to sustain economic growth, but you need the economic growth to fund the infrastructure. And so which way does it go and how interrelated are those two things is very difficult to understand. But a 700 billion rand infrastructure boost is, I think it's good news, but it's hard to know where the money's going to come from.
Very, very interesting. I'm also completely perplexed as to where that comes from. A couple of episodes back, Barry and I did a bit of Googling in terms of South Africa's GDP, and that is a huge, huge number, especially with debt levels. Where are they actually going to get that cash? I know in the upcoming budget speech, a lot of people have been talking about potentially rising VAT rates again. Obviously, for wealthier people, the extra tax brackets, all of those kinds of things always get brought about when we start to look at these kind of deficits. But that is still a huge number. I don't know how we'd get that without it being debt.
Yeah, definitely. It is a big number. I think it's worth noting, I don't think it's just this year. I think it's probably a 5 or 10 year project. So it's not 700 billion rand in 2020, but it still is a crazy amount of money. And like you say, the tax base is not growing like it should because we got such a huge proportion who's under the tax threshold and we don't have enough people carrying that tax base. And so where that 700 billion is going to come, I don't know. Hopefully there's a lot of foreign investment that maybe might be able to fund that kind of stuff. So you might see China getting involved. You might see the US coming and getting involved, because these sorts of infrastructure plans are exactly what these first world countries are wanting to invest in Africa. And so maybe it's been led by foreign investment. But wherever it comes from, the hope is that money actually gets spent well and doesn't get siphoned off into private pockets like we've seen in the past, right? So the biggest concern here is that we're going to put out all these tenders for all these new jobs, and we have to make sure that the right people get the right job at the right price. And the corruption that has kind of crippled South Africa over the last 20 years, that's the risk of this, is that how much of the 700 billion is actually going to go to genuine infrastructure developments that are going to help our country, and how much of it are going to get lost in the bureaucracy and the corruption that we see here.
Well, we'll certainly have to see. I mean, there's no doubt that there's a wealth of opportunity in Africa, and certainly if these things are handled at source, just like you said, I could definitely see other countries getting involved. This next one looks pretty worrying.
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure how to talk about this because there's so little information so far. But basically, there's talk about the ANC or the government at the moment bringing out a state-owned bank, right? So I know what you're thinking. Of course, we need another state-owned enterprise. They've done so well in the past. Why don't we start another one, right? That's what you're thinking, I know. And so we need
Absolutely.
an ANC-led bank. And so, yeah, so it's still very early stages. There's very little information about what it might look like. The reasoning behind it is that they want to bring financial services to the majority of the population who don't have access to them. And so I understand that reasoning. I think that for a lot of the major banks, the poorest of our country are simply not worth banking because the cost of banking them is more than the fees they would earn. And so a lot of the major banks won't even look at you if you're under a certain income bracket. And so as far as I understand, this bank is going to try and provide services to that kind of income bracket. Whether they can do it effectively and efficiently, I don't know. I think that the South African banking industry is one of the strongest in the world, and so hopefully we can learn from some of the lessons we've learned in the last little bit. Our Reserve Bank is very well regarded, and so hopefully they're well involved in the process as well. And so I don't know what I think about this. It is of course worrying because what we've seen in the past with state-owned enterprises, but we have to wait and see as to more information and look at what is this going to look like going forward. A state-owned bank is terrifying in words, but maybe when we actually see what the plans are, we might change our minds.
Indeed, we'll have to see. I'm really glad that the sort of target of this bank is not the Reserve Bank, because that has been attracting a lot of attention. For some strange reason, ANC politicians want to nationalize the Reserve Bank, one of the only entities that actually has real good integrity in our economy. And so I'm really glad that this wasn't what was being announced here.
Across the pond.